Hey class, welcome back to our new set of notes on Unit 4. This is going to be discussing land and water use. To begin with, we'll be looking at our big goal and the big ideas. Obviously, what do we use our land and water for? A large portion of land and water is used to feed our growing population. So the goal is to feed our world, essentially, right? And the question from there is, can we do that? Can we feed the world? There's been estimates recently that have generated this statistic that about 1.5 times the food needed to feed the world is produced. So the answer is yes, we can feed the world with our ability to produce food at this point in time. However, 3 billion people are still malnourished, which refers to the fact that they don't have an appropriate diet. They may have enough calories, but not a well-balanced diet in terms of vitamins and things like that. 1 billion are undernourished, which means there's not enough calories necessary, and starvation is a common symptom with those individuals, versus malnourished people tend to have poor health for other reasons. And then we have 1 billion people on the planet that are overnourished, which means we have too many calories being consumed, common in developed nations, and leading to other health problems like obesity, heart disease. Why is it challenging, though, if we produce so much food? One is lack of arable farming land. Ideally, when we look at the planet, we think, man, there's so much space. Like, we could grow a ton of food anywhere. But ultimately, like, when we talk about like land, we think first, well, how much is land? Well, we get like a quarter of the planet about that's land, right? So then we have, ice-free land. Well, we have to look at that too. So that's what we're starting with here is ice-free land. How much of our ice-free land now could we farm on? Well, about 46% of that is undeveloped, but we got to look at it like, why is it undeveloped? Well, we have forests, high mountains, tundra, deserts, right? Like, which of these things would we be able to grow food in? They're not real hospitable for that. Forest maybe, but the rest is not going to happen. So then when we talk about agricultural space, now we have pasture land and cropland being used there. So about 38.6% of the surface area is usable for that. Other problems with other places and where we can't use another 14%, like erosion, areas susceptible to erosion, homes, urban areas, logging, quarries, stuff you can't have real productive agriculture on. So to begin with, there's this tiny like area of space that's usable in terms of arable farmland. Other reasons that we're not feeding the world with all the food that we grow: poverty and unequal distribution, not having access to food or technology to create food is an issue. Lack of access to just basics, clean water in our very developing nations, our very Lead Sea nations, and then poor harvesting practices, agricultural practices in certain countries, degrading the environment. So this bit of land that is usable, arable land, is being treated poorly and stops becoming so usable, and prevents them from being productive as they could be in growing those crops. So to begin here, we're going to talk about the Green Revolution. How come we can grow so much food? Well, the Green Revolution is this period beginning in the 50s where we talk about crop yields essentially tripling due to the industrialized agriculture system kind of coming into its own here. So technology was a big part of it, between big combines and tractors, and the ability to use fossil fuels instead of manual labor in the fields allowed work to get done faster and more efficiently. Certainly other things like irrigation technology, chemical technology like fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, and then moving into genetic technology and being able to modify crops to grow faster or better in harsher conditions or resistant to pests. Those are all beneficial. For livestock, discovery of being able to utilize different types of feed to maximize the gains in the animals, antibiotics to keep them healthy and have them grow larger. All these things led to this tripling of crop yields. So these are examples here: irrigation technology, spraying fertilizers, pesticides, um, herbicides there, killing weeds, antibiotics for our cattle, and then BT corn is something we'll talk about in class with genetic modification. All of this together um, adds up and is not without consequence. So yes, it tripled crop yields, but there's a price to be paid for that kind of growth. One of the things that we have to consider when we talk about that type of growth is land use in itself. So we talk about land use being restricted, and there's not a ton of land available for agricultural purposes. So we look at meat consumption. Meat consumption is increasing worldwide. The reason we look at meat consumption first is because it requires 20 times more land area than just growing the crops just for direct consumption. One of the reasons for that is it requires 20 times more land is because a lot of the food we grow is grown for animal feed. So only 55% of the calories from crops are actually eaten by people. The majority of that is taken in for food or fuel, essentially, to create the ethanol. So ultimately, what's a benefit for reducing meat consumption? Well, less meat is reduced greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, improving water and soil quality. And we'll talk about how those things are all impacted from the different types of agricultural systems we have in place. Remember, kilograms of grain to produce a kilogram of meat. It takes a lot of grain to feed the cattle versus if you were just to eat that 1 kilogram of grain yourself, there would be more to go around. But feeding an animal to have it grow and get bigger requires more land area to grow more food for the animal itself. In the other images below, we're looking at areas where we have food and then fuel and feed grown, and you can see the purple in developed nations. You see more purple, like United States and all these European nations. A lot of the food grown is for feed and fuel, having a higher consumption of meat in their diets in these developed nations, versus developing areas tend to use the more majority of crops to grow food for themselves for direct consumption. Understanding that part of industrialization and our demographic transition is that these areas are probably going to start to become more purple as time passes. Croplands and rangelands is another thing to look at, and we'll talk about these later, but understand kind of the distribution of where's crops and where's rangelands for grazing cattle. So types of agriculture, they have an organizer to fill out here with a labellet. The types of agriculture for crop production, the two major ones to talk about is industrialized agriculture down here, and then slash and burn and shifting agriculture over here. Industrialized agriculture, as mentioned before, we talked about all the things that are going in: fertilizers, pesticides, fossil fuels, tons of water from pumping of aquifers. What's the goal of this? The goal is to produce really fast, high-yield crops that are going to end up being hopefully cheap for consumption and purchase. And in order to do that, the monocrop strategy, the growing only in one crop, tends to show up here. Because it lends itself to more efficient production. The problem, environmental impacts, essentially is loss of biodiversity. By growing one crop, we have a lot of greenhouse gas production from this. Pollution, water, and air contamination is a common environmental impact. And outputs of food produced, soy, wheat, and corn are the primary ones here. Most of these are genetically modified, of course, as that increases the efficiency as well. Then we move over to like a slash and burn type system or shifting cultivation. And basically this is more of a, let's see, developing nation strategy, particularly in tropical regions as they have lower soil nutrients, but it's more of a manual labor, animal, hand tool, that kind of thing, where forests are cut down and burned. The ash then fertilizes that. So they'll till that up, they'll mix that up with the fertilized ash. And that will increase soil nutrients and allow crops to be grown for a period of time. Once the crops are losing fertility in that soil, obviously, then they'll move to another area, slash and burn, and continue to kind of alternate locations. Really big problem is loss of biodiversity and species, for sure, especially in our tropical rainforests that have most of our biodiversity. We also have increasing greenhouse gases emissions from the deforestation itself, and carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide again. Damages soil structure, increases erosion. Really bad stuff for the environment. The outputs are lots of mixed crops or whatever it is typically not a monocrop situation. Types of agriculture for meat production. Now we're talking about meat production. We're kind of looking at the industrialized model here, which is the CAFO. This is a concentrated animal feeding operation. Also can be referred to as feedlots. Versus free-range grazing. These are both typically Med-C. You see them in Med-C countries for sure. A developing nation probably doesn't have CAFO. A truly developed nation probably doesn't have a CAFO system in place. So any animals they would eat would be free-range grazing. However, you saw on that map before, most of the developing nations have a higher consumption of grain and a lower consumption of meat as well, so it's less of an issue for them. However, the CAFO strategy, pack them in really crowded areas, get them really big, really fast, and raise them to slaughter as quick as you can and as big as they can, again, to maximize efficiency, feed more people in the system, and it does a great job with that. So hormones, antibiotics, feed, high-calorie feed, and a lot of it can get the animals larger, ready for slaughter. They're in these crowded locations, though, so what ends up happening sometimes is there's disease passed between them. There's a tremendous amount of manure and waste generated from these things, and are sometimes put in big manure lagoons that are used to kind of treat the water, essentially. But dealing with the waste is one of the biggest issues, as well as spread of disease. So it does generate greenhouse gases as a result of that. But we get beef and pork and chicken in these really highly concentrated environments, and we can get a lot of it, which leads to a cheaper product to drive prices down. The free-range grazing is grass and grazing land. This is really the natural kind of cycle for the most part, as the fertilizers are the waste of the animals themselves. They eat grass. They can rotate them from area to area to prevent overgrazing. If they don't, overgrazing can be an issue. But ultimately, you can get your beef and chicken and pork still in this kind of more natural free-range environment. The biggest downside is it's slower for production. It can take about 4 months longer for cattle to be 4 to 6 months longer for cattle to be raised for slaughter than compared to like a CAFO setup, and it makes the product more expensive as a result of that.